Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today, we're going to be, like I said, getting into some economics, specifically Irish economics. We're going to be using the Strand Four Notes as a jumping off point. And a lot of the stuff can seem really dry at first, but I think once you start getting into it, it's really fascinating to see how a country's economic engine works.
Yeah, it's interesting. We talk about the economy as if it's this big abstract thing, out there.
Right.
But it's really, the sum of countless individual decisions,
Yeah.
transactions, and really lives, you know.
It's trying to see the forest for the trees a little bit.
Exactly, yeah.
And speaking of kind of zooming out and trying to get a sense of the big picture, these notes start out by talking about national income statistics, which
Yeah.
is kind of like a country's economic report card in a way. But like, how do you even begin to measure something as massive and complex as a nation's income?
It's surprisingly intricate. You might think it's as simple as just, adding up everyone's paychecks,
Right.
but it's much more nuanced than that.
Right, because it's not just like, how's the stock market doing? It's like, are people actually doing better? Are they? Then
Exactly.
what about things like, work that's done in the home by stay-at-home parents or by volunteers or, even just like the underground economy? Like that's all part of a country's economic activity too, even if it doesn't show up on a traditional balance sheet.
Exactly. And, traditional national income calculations, while helpful, definitely have their limitations.
Yeah.
And, that's why economists use a few different approaches to try and, capture the full picture.
Okay.
One is the expenditure approach, which looks at how much everyone is spending within the economy.
Okay.
Another is the production approach, which focuses on the value of all the goods and services produced.
Makes sense.
And then you've got the incomes approach, which, as you might guess, tallies up everyone's income.
Okay, so it's kind of like taking different measurements of the same thing to try to get a more holistic view.
Exactly.
It's like, if you're measuring a room, like you want to know its length and its width and its height to
Yeah.
really get a sense of the size.
Exactly. Yeah. And imagine, Ireland experiences a surge in, construction. Using the production approach, we'd measure the value of those new buildings. The expenditure approach would track all the spending on materials and labor, and the incomes approach would reveal the wages earned by those construction workers.
Right.
So each approach is telling part of the story,
Right.
but together they paint a more, comprehensive picture of the economic activity generated by this construction boom.
So it's less about any single number being like the correct number.
Yeah,
It's more about the story that these numbers tell us when you put them all together.
exactly.
But I guess even with these different approaches, are there still like gaps? I mean, what about things like, environmental impact or, overall well-being? Like those have an economic value as well, right?
Yeah, you've hit on a critical point.
Hmm.
While these measures are, valuable tools, they don't capture everything.
Right.
For example, a country could have a really high GDP but suffer from severe income inequality,
Right.
or rapid industrial growth, could come at the cost of environmental degradation.
So if those traditional figures aren't telling the whole story, are there other ways to kind of gauge a country's well-being, like metrics that take things like environmental sustainability or social factors into account? Okay, so we've got a handle on how economists at least try to, wrap their heads around this idea of like measuring a nation's economic activity and all the, inherent complexities there. But let's shift gears for a second and talk about the role of government, specifically something called fiscal policy.
Yeah, so this is all about, government decisions on taxes and spending. It's basically the levers they can pull to try to influence the economy. Think of it as trying to steer a giant ship.
And I'm guessing it's a little more complicated than like deciding whether to order takeout or cook at home, right? We're talking about billions of euros being moved around and allocated to different areas.
Absolutely. Yeah, and, you've got on the one hand government revenue,
Yeah.
right? The money they collect, and that primarily comes from taxes.
Yeah.
Income tax, VAT, corporate taxes. You see this on your paychecks and your bills.
Oh, yeah, I know those deductions all too well. But yeah, it's interesting to think about like, okay, where does it all go, right? It's like all of these individual contributions flowing into this massive pool of money that the government then has to figure out how to manage.
Exactly. And managing it effectively is, where this idea of fiscal policy comes in. They use that pool of money for things like public services, healthcare, education infrastructure, social welfare programs, supporting the unemployed, the elderly, those in need.
So it's kind of like this giant balancing act, right? Trying to meet the needs of citizens today while also investing in the future.
Precisely. And it's not just about sort of maintaining the status quo.
Mhm.
Fiscal policy is also used to try and, influence the overall direction of the economy. So, for
Mm.
example, during a recession, the government might increase spending or cut taxes to try to stimulate economic activity and boost employment.
Right. It's fascinating to think about how, those decisions at the top, whether it's, increasing spending on infrastructure projects or, adjusting income tax brackets or whatever it might be, can have this kind of ripple effect impacting, everything from job creation to, the price of a loaf of bread.
Exactly. It's all interconnected. But there's another crucial aspect of fiscal policy that we need to touch on here, and that's government debt.
Ah, their dreaded D word.
Right.
I know I remember reading in these notes that Ireland's national debt is over 200 billion. Like that sounds a little terrifying to be honest.
Yeah, it's a big number for sure. But the thing about debt is it's not inherently good or bad. It's all about context.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it like this. If you take out a mortgage to buy a house, you're going into debt.
Right.
But that debt allows you to own an asset that will hopefully, appreciate in value over time.
Okay, so it's kind of like a mortgage for the country in a way.
In a way, yes. Governments often take on debt to finance, large-scale projects that will benefit the country in the long run. Things
Hmm.
like new hospitals, roads, renewable energy infrastructure, investments that would be really difficult to make all at once using just current tax revenue.
So it's a way of kind of spreading the cost of these big investments over time, kind of like how, we as individuals might take out loans to buy a house or a car.
Exactly.
But I guess if it's mismanaged, debt can become a burden, right? Like what happens if a government is spending more than it takes in for, an extended period?
Yeah, that's when you start running into potential trouble. We call that a budget deficit. And if it becomes chronic, it can lead to some, unwanted consequences. Things like inflation, where the cost of goods and services starts to rise really rapidly, or higher interest rates, which can make it more expensive for businesses and individuals to borrow money.
Right. So it sounds like there's this delicate balance to strike, right? Like using debt strategically to invest in the future while also, being mindful of keeping it at a manageable level.
Exactly. And that, my friend, is why understanding fiscal policy is so crucial.
Yeah.
It allows us to evaluate those decisions being made on our behalf and understand their potential impact on our lives, both now and in the future.
All right. So we've tackled national income, we've demystified fiscal policy. I think, are you ready to dive into the deep end of the financial sector? This is the part that always feels like a bit of a black box to me.
It does seem that way, doesn't it? All those terms like liquidity trap and fractional reserve banking, enough to make anyone's head spin.
Yeah.
But at its core, the financial sector is really just a system for, channeling money to where it can be put to work.
Right. And it's something that we interact with constantly, even if we don't always realize it. Like every time we swipe our debit card or take out a loan or even just like check our bank balance, we're plugging into this, complex web of institutions and markets.
It's exactly.
Yeah.
Let's break it down a little bit. There are different types of financial markets. You've got money markets, which are all about short-term lending and borrowing. Kind of think of it as the financial sector's overnight lending market. Then there are capital markets. This is where companies and governments go to raise long-term capital through things like stocks and bonds.
So like if I buy a company's stock, like I'm basically becoming like a tiny little investor in that company,
Yeah.
hoping that they'll, make money and my investment will grow.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And then finally, you have foreign exchange markets, and this is where currencies are bought and sold. So, every time you travel abroad and, exchange your euros for another currency, you're participating in the foreign exchange market.
Huh. Right. It's amazing how it's all kind of interconnected. But I gotta say, one thing I always found kind of perplexing is like, how is money actually created? I mean, I always kind of pictured like, the government just like printing more of it whenever they need it.
Yeah, it's a common misconception. The reality is most money in an economy isn't created by printing presses. It's actually created through bank lending, a process known as fractional reserve banking.
Okay, now you're just using big words to try to impress me. How does that work?
So imagine you deposit, 100 euro into your bank account.
Hmm.
The bank is required to hold a certain percentage of that deposit in reserve, say 10%, but the remaining 90%, they can lend that out to someone else. That borrower then uses those funds to, make a purchase. The recipient of that purchase might deposit those funds back into another bank, which can then lend out a portion of that deposit and so on and so forth.
So it's like that initial 100 deposit has the potential to kind of like ripple through the economy, supporting multiple loans and transactions along the way.
Exactly. It's a powerful system for creating credit and stimulating economic activity. Of course, it's also a system that needs careful oversight to make sure that things don't get out of hand.
Right, which brings us to the role of central banks, right? They're kind of like the referees of the financial system in a lot of ways.
Precisely. They set interest rates, they control the money supply, and they generally just try to keep everything running smoothly. Think of them as the guardians against things like runaway inflation or financial crises.
And in Ireland's case, our central bank is the European Central Bank because we're part of the Eurozone, right?
That's right. And, being part of a larger currency union like the Eurozone has its own, advantages and drawbacks.
Which I'm sure are complex issues with, significant implications.
Wow. It's amazing how much ground we've covered today, from trying to decipher these kind of cryptic Strand Four Notes to like really uncovering the inner workings of national economies. I feel like I learned a lot.
Yeah, me too. And, we've really just scratched the surface here. Economics is a vast and, endlessly fascinating subject. Yeah, it really is. But hopefully this deep dive has given you, dear listener, a better understanding of how it all works, from, how we even measure a country's economic output to the role of government to the, complexities of the financial sector. And like you said, I think the most important thing is to stay curious, right? Keep asking those questions, keep digging deeper, and you never know what you might find.
Couldn't agree more.